Ever since the pandemic hit the United States, it has been hard for me to imagine a time when everything was normal, and it's hard to say if anything will be normal ever again. With that being said, I've also been very intrigued about what the world might look like post-pandemic. For this research project, I wanted to focus on the behaviors that we are adopting to keep ourselves and our communities safe during this time. These behaviors include hand washing, disinfecting, wearing masks and gloves, and physical distancing from others. My initial hunt statement was to speculate if these behaviors that we are developing will persist after the pandemic is over. In short, my project is about behaviors and habits. To conduct my research, I sent out a survey, and from those survey responses, I was able to find interviewees. I also collected data via participant observations, and lastly, I asked a few of my interviewees to write a short story on what they thought the world may look like post-pandemic. My survey received 45 responses. This is where I got most of my numbers and percentages on what safety measures people are partaking in. This data gave me a baseline on what people are doing and how they are protecting themselves. I also conducted 4 interviews. In this phase, I gained some emotional insights on the pandemic as well as the reasons why people take certain safety measures over others. I also asked my participants if they would allow me to observe their process of the things they do when they either leave or return to their homes. From this, I learned how these safety measures take place in our regular pre-pandemic routines and how easy or difficult they are to incorporate into our daily lives. So where did all this data get me? I reviewed my survey responses, interview recordings, and insights from my participant observations, and wrote down things I found interesting. Then I took everything I wrote down and made an affinity diagram. I had rearranged my data points a few times until I found something I was happy with. I put my data into 2 main categories: general insights about the pandemic and insights related to habits and behaviors. My project was only related to the habits and behaviors, but I thought it was important that I had an idea of the bigger picture. This helped me organize my data, so it was easier for me to interpret and come to solid conclusions. I then developed a stakeholder map, with my thing of interest being the safety of an individual. The items in the bubbles around it either have a relationship with the individual or negatively impact the individual to varying degrees. So, what is my point with all this? Referring back to my hunt statement, my intent for this project was to create some predictions of what the future might look like after the pandemic, specifically regarding our newfound safety behaviors. Let's review the safety measures before diving in. The CDC recommends to regularly wash hands, disinfect objects and surfaces, wear a mask, and physical distance from one another. Early in the project, I did some preliminary research on the development of habits, and I learned that it takes anywhere from 18 to 254 days to develop a habit. In short, it is too early to tell if any of the safety behaviors will continue to be habits after the pandemic. But I hypothesize that they will, or at least some of them will. This really depends on the household, as each household has their own routine on how they perform these behaviors. Not only are new behaviors being introduced, but they are changing how we execute our pre-existing routines. This isn't much of a surprise, since that is what most people are complaining about. Since these behaviors will vary from person to person, I don't think they will last much longer than the pandemic itself. People will only continue to partake in these behaviors simply because they like the idea of them, and even that will fade over time, as there won't be a necessity to do these things. This hypothesis applies to all mentioned behaviors except for one. Physical distancing is unlike these other behaviors in that it does not have a physical counterpart like a mask. It is entirely a mental behavior. When we go out into public and get too close to someone we don't know, the immediate response is to make space between you and them. If we are unable to make space, a feeling of discomfort will overcome us. This behavior is more likely to become a habit in most of us since it doesn't have an object attached to it, and the trigger is just someone getting too close. I predict, since that this is more of a subconscious habit, it will be present in society much longer than the other behaviors will. I can't say exactly how long, but we will just have to wait and see. Even though this is a traumatic and devastating time for all of us, it is important that we continue to look ahead to the future. I mentioned earlier that I had asked my participants to write a short story on what the future looks like after the pandemic has ceased. Unfortunately, I only got one response from this, but it provided a sweet message. The story talked about a world where people are relying more on each other and their local communities. Healthcare is accessible to everyone, and the environment is thriving as we have learned how to take care of it. And overall, we are more united as members of the human race. Even though the world has been turned upside down, it is important we make the most of it and stay hopeful towards the future.